Okay, I think we are live. So hi everyone. Good afternoon from Singapore, and good morning from Germany as well. So as we have one speaker dialing in from there. So welcome all to today's event. We are going to launch our latest publication from the APACMed Digital Health Committee. This is a position paper where we discuss how to harness the power of interoperability within medical devices. It was co-published with Unity. So I'm really proud today to have Stefan from Unity speaking, Shamini from Abbott. She is also the chair of the Interoperability Working Group at APACMed, and Gregg from Caretech, also a very supportive and engaged member of this working group. So if we go to the next slide, please, I will just start with a simple technical instruction. If you have any question that you like to ask, you can use the chat. So we will try to answer all of them during the panel discussion or at the end of this webinar. So please use the chat and we'll monitor that. Next, please. Yeah, so this is, it's really a pleasure for me to host this webinar today, because this paper, I think we started to work on it around May or June last year. So 6 months of hard work from the entire community, and it really meets the purpose of our Digital Health Committee, that is basically creating and sharing knowledge on digital health, and then advocate for regional policies. So for those of you who read the paper and who will do, you will see that there are both these components, right? So trying to explain through use cases, examples, what's the impact of medical device interoperability on patient management, and on the other side, also starting to provide some recommendation to the deciders in the industry. For those who don't know us, so we created this Digital Health Committee at APACMed at the beginning of last year. We now have a community of more than 120 members coming from more than 45 companies. And we work around several areas that are crucial for our members in the region, in the APAC region. Cybersecurity, reimbursement, regulatory, and of course, interoperability. I would like now to hand over to Stefan, that is going to explain you and to guide you through the paper, explain you how we did how we built the use cases, the narratives, and also the standards and the recommendation that we provide to the different stakeholders in the industry. And then after that, we will have a panel discussion with Gregg and Shamini to answer some of the questions that we prepared. So over to you, Stefan, and see you later during the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and good afternoon or good morning from my time to all of you. My name is Stefan Schlichting. I am currently working at Unity Consulting, especially focusing on the branches of healthcare, medical devices development, medical IT, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for some of the standards that we might hear about later. If you have any questions there, feel free to ask. I'm really proud to be here together with Shamini and Gregg, and to present to you the position paper from APACMed, Harnessing the Power of Interoperability Within Medical Devices, an Asian Pacific Perspective. And what I would like to do now in probably the next 15 to 20 minutes is I would like to walk you through the paper, what's in there, what you will find there if you read it, and also to prepare our panel discussion a little bit so that you know what we are talking about later on with Shamini and Gregg. So first of all, I would like to start with a short definition. When we talk about interoperability, what does that actually mean for us? So Let's talk about medical device interoperability. So from what I know is there's actually no real single definition of medical device interoperability or interoperability with medical devices, and different organizations use it always slightly differently. So in our working group, we have come up with one definition that is based on the definition of the HIMSS, and it is related here, so that interoperability is the ability of different information systems, devices, and applications, or systems if you would like to sum it up, to access, exchange, integrate, and cooperatively use data in a coordinated manner within and across organizational, regional, and national boundaries to provide timely and seamless data or portability of information and optimize the health of individual populations globally. Applying these two systems that comprise at least one medical device, as we have tried to depict it in here, in vitro diagnostic device or personal health device. And this is what we understand as a group as medical device interoperability, and what we will leverage throughout this position paper when we refer to that term. Before we start to dig into all the details from a process perspective, we as a group thought that it would be very helpful to come to this topic, or to near to this topic down, by using interoperability scenarios. So what we have done is that we basically collected a lot of scenarios, and we included some of them inside of the position paper. So these scenarios we picked for the purpose that they allow us to explain where it is very helpful to use medical device interoperability, and how medical device interoperability can actually be used to solve these kind of scenarios, to implement them, to realize them. And these scenarios really range from a broad perspective, from remote monitoring of daily activities for cancer diagnosis, over to intra-hospital protection of clinical staff while they are caring for infectious patients. But we also have, for example, scenarios in there regarding childhood immunization, or something like the fast infection screening and on-site confirmation for tests at the airport regarding, for example, Corona. For today, for our presentation, we picked one scenario, and this is the example of the telehealth loop for chronic disease. And I would like now to get a little bit more into the detail of that scenario. In this scenario, we basically follow a 75 years old man with type 2 diabetes, and that man lives far away from the next hospital, but he needs support for his diabetes management. And in order to support him and to avoid the long travel distancing, he is basically offered a telehealth consultation. And in order to that this work, the hospital offers him a glucose monitor, which he can use to really monitor the glucose on a daily basis, or even more often. And this data is fed from the wearable device that he has over a gateway into the EMR via the manufacturing cloud. This allows especially the clinical staff to really look at all the up-to-date data, and the man that we follow here doesn't have to come into a hospital for that. What he's also offered during the telehealth consultation is that he can participate in a video consultation. And this will allow really that he can, on a daily basis, for example, talking to the nurse that helps him to manage his diabetes, and answer questions that may arise during the day. And we think that is a perfect example where data is exchanged, where the data has to be meaningful interpreted, in this case, for example, by the hospital, and where interoperability standards or technology will really yield a benefit, because then you can basically attach any kind of sensor, include it into the EMR, connect it with the rest of the data about the patient, and have a full picture of where he currently stands in managing his diabetes and what might be the next actions, so that he is helped more. For example, there's during diabetes management, he might need to be having a lab test for his current glucose level. And we also describe in this scenario that this might be automatically booked through other systems or by the help of the nurse. So it's a really good scenario that has all aspects in it, from managing the clinical workflow, getting data from the devices, combine it with what is already known about the patient in the hospital, and combine so that those that take care of the patient have the full picture and can really help him. And I think we will discuss maybe a little bit about the scenarios later during our panel discussion. So what I would like to do now is basically to jump over to the next big part of the position paper, and that is about the medical device interoperability standards. And even though I am really a standards guy, I don't want to bother you with all the details of the technical standards. What I would like to highlight here is really that if you recall our definition of medical device interoperability, it included the ability of different information systems, devices, and applications to access, exchange, integrate, and cooperatively use data in a coordinated manner. And for that, interoperability standards are really perfect to realize these kind of systems and, for example, to realize these scenarios that we just have seen before. So inside of the position paper, we do present different standards that range from pure technical specifications, like, for example, IEEE 1173 standard series or DICOM, over to HS7 version 2 or FHIR and IHE profiles, but we also include standards that are related more to terminology or semantics, like SNOMED or LOINC. And we think that we basically give a very broad overview about those standards that are applicable in the APAC region for implementing these kinds of scenarios that we have outlined. What I would like to do now is really to go into the part that we think is very important for the future success or for the fast adoption and realization of these kind of scenarios. For that purpose, we included recommendations for different stakeholders inside of the position paper, because we think it just doesn't help if we would just list standard that could be used to harness the power of interoperability and to realize these scenarios. But it is very important for different stakeholders that they act in a certain way and help us, the whole community, to get a faster adoption of these kind of technologies and standards. So, for example, we included recommendations for hospitals, and we included also recommendations for manufacturers and medical technology providers. And we included as well recommendations for agencies and governmental bodies. And what I would like to do now is I would like to start actually with recommendations for the hospitals. So on the one side, the hospitals are, of course, those, let's say, stakeholders or have those stakeholders that really later on use and buy the products that might integrate medical device interoperability technologies. So on the one hand, I think what is very important is if the hospital has in its strategy, or actually has a strategy for becoming a digital hospital, they should include medical device interoperability of one of the key technologies or enablers for having a successful implementation of such a strategy. I think here the most important aspect is really that they do have a digital agenda, that they do have a strategy to become a digital hospital. And if they have decided to go that route, that they really include medical device interoperability based on standards as part of that strategy. I think this comes together naturally with for example, procurement. So if you buy technology as a hospital, it is, from our perspective, highly recommended to include some language inside of your RFIs or RFPs during the procurement process that refers to different IHE profiles and, of course, international adopted standards or country-specific standards if they are required. And of course, we know that not all of these standards are already, let's say, overall adopted in all products. So you might consider as a procurement department to have more a staged approach where you maybe give better ratings for those that have it already implemented and maybe a medium-sized rating for those that have it on their roadmap and can really demonstrate it to you that they're working on it. And maybe it's not so good if you don't consider, as a manufacturer, if you don't consider standards or IHE profiles at all. Then, of course, we do have below here the IT and clinical engineering stuff. I think for this group that really helps to run and operate all these technologies, and that makes it possible that these scenarios really can come to life. I think it's highly important that they, if they haven't started yet, to define a management process to handle interoperable medical device systems. So, for example, one of the big portions, if we, for example, look in the scenario that we have described for getting the data from the outside, so from the let's say diabetes or the glucose monitoring system into your EMR. For that purpose, there needs to be an interface, of course, that you can ingest this data into your EMR. This has to be managed. And of course, all the cybersecurity aspects for these, let's say, open interfaces have to be managed as well. So this might be something new. This might be also something challenging for the IT and clinical engineering departments, but it's definitely worth it, especially if we look up to this point up here, that if the hospital wants to follow a digital agenda and include or become a digital hospital over the time. I think then the last point, this is important, and this is also what we see is kind of a tricky part. If I look in my normal routine inside who sits on standards committees, it's typically people like me from consulting companies or from the manufacturers. There are also people from agencies, but we typically don't have that much participation or engagement from clinical staff in all these standards committees. And this actually makes it very hard for us as those that write the standards or the profiles to really meet the needs of those that will in the end hopefully benefit from all the effort that we do there. So My request would be here, or my call for action would be here. If you have clinical staff and you want to move forward your digital agenda as a hospital, it would be really great if some of these people can support those that write the technical specification and guiding them into the right direction, so that it's not just fancy technology, but really helps in the end. I would like now to come actually to the next part of the recommendations, and this would be for manufacturers. So for manufacturers, they're really like torn probably between two sides. On the one hand, there might be the chance that they see, okay, why should I open my system if I can provide everything? On the other hand, we try to include a decision path in here, and what we have seen is, for example, for the telehealth scenario that we have shown there, there's probably not one single manufacturer that provides everything to you. So it has to be that those that participate in these scenarios have to interact, be interoperable with others that support this scenario. And of course, you could just talk to another company, make an agreement, and try to provide it in combination. But what our experience is that this changes so much, and it's different from region to region and from country to country who your partner would be, that it's probably best for a manufacturer to say, okay, we align on a common standard, on a common profile that we can use for that purpose, and then it's basically that we can move from one scenario to the others, have a standardized interface, and lower also our development costs, because we don't have to adopt to all the regional settings anymore, or different caregivers or care settings, because we say, okay, this is our standard, we have aligned on it, and so this allows seamless integration. So for manufacturers, we give like a recommendation path, some kind of decision criteria that they should look at and really think about, okay, wouldn't it be beneficial if we integrate an interface into our products that uses interoperable standards? And wouldn't this address actually really the need, for example, of the hospitals later on, so that they can build up their scenarios from multiple manufacturers and have in the end the best clinical support for their patients. And I think one of the big questions here really is, does a standard already exist? And as I mentioned before, we have outlined a lot of these standards beforehand. So look into the list. And if you have further questions, if you didn't find a standard, you can always ask one of the interoperability working group, who will try to help you and give you more advice where to find these kind of standards. I would like to come to my last slide with what we have here is a recommendation for agencies and regulatory bodies. And what we think is, we had now the hospitals that use the products, that want to implement and realize these scenarios. We had the manufacturers and medical technology providers that provide the equipment for that. But of course, we do have a regulatory environment, and we need to somehow make the way that these technology actually can get into the market. And of course, we could also get some benefit out of it for the regulatory agencies or bodies. So for example, they could use the data very easily, or accesses and compare data from different manufacturers to assess the performance, for example, of products. I think this would also actually be beneficial for an improved clinical outcome, because you can really now combine data from multiple sources, multiple products together, and get the full picture of the patient. And of course, for example, in these days, it would be very helpful to have one big data pool that could be analyzed to find patterns, for example, and that might help to manage a pandemic. And last but not least, I think it's very helpful to have a value-based care approach inside of a region, because it allows you really to collect the full picture over a patient. Did the therapy, for example, work in a hospital, by collecting all these data points over the whole patient journey. That were the three recommendations, or the recommendation for the three stakeholder groups that we basically included in the position paper. And I could really, or I would really like to summarize it as this position paper explains the impact of medical device interoperability on patients through use cases, use scenarios. It provides an overview about standards that are already adopted in the market and that could be used to realize these scenarios. And it really gives recommendations to healthcare stakeholders from the groups of hospitals, medical device manufacturers, and medical technology providers, as well as governmental agencies and regulatory bodies. And I hope after my short presentation about the content of the position paper, you will read it in full and have later on questions. And yes, we would be happy to answer that. As a next point, I would like to go into a panel discussion with Shamini and Gregg. And if you have questions for us as the speakers, please put them into the chat and we will try to address them at the end of the panel discussion. And I would like now to invite Shamini and Gregg to join the discussion. And maybe we start with the first round of introductions. Maybe Shamini, you want to start with that?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Stefan. It's nice to meet everybody today. My name is Shamini. I've currently taken on a new role at Abbott, actually, to expand our biosensing technologies platform globally, which is slightly different to what I used to be doing, but I'm deeply passionate about what we're talking about today. Prior to the role at Abbott, I was actually a digital transformation director at McDonald's. So digital has always been at the heart of what I do, and certainly moving into digital health and tech is something that I fundamentally believe is really critical for us to empower patients, and particularly in the cases of chronic disease management, support the changing landscape of care in the world. So over to you, Gregg.
Hi everyone, my name is Gregg Boalch. I'm Managing Director of Caretech Services, based here in Australia, but we operate in 5 countries. My background comes from a health systems perspective. Actually do it 2 ways. My background comes from a health systems background of developing systems in hospital pathology, radiology, et cetera, since I was a brunette. And I've also I've also had a history in bringing industry players together to work together to achieve outcomes for the general community.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Shamini and Gregg, for your introduction. And I would actually like to start now with the first question. And maybe, Shamini, we start with you. So from your experience, what are the tailwinds and the headwinds for adoption of interoperable medical device systems in the APAC region?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start with the bad news and then finish up with some of the good news. So, look, from a headwinds perspective, I think one of the major things, which you've already raised, Stefan, is how do we prove this value out? How do we think about the health economics of interoperability? And if you look at a comparable industry, if you look at how consumer healthcare does it, or consumer tech does it, they do it by basically drawing correlations in big, gigantic data lakes. So they're not super concerned about, creating a formulaic structure with clinical studies and some of the strict standards we certainly adopt, with some of our critical actors. And as a result of that, they've actually probably been able to get further ahead, certainly further ahead faster. So that's points to my second headwind. I think there is potential for us as a committee of interested individuals, interested organizations and companies to actually think about the capability set that we need, moving forward. And the data component of interoperability is really critical. It's also very, very hard to accomplish and do. So we absolutely have to build deep capability in the data science components alongside the clinical science that would go, in partnership with any of the proving out of use cases. I think underpinning this is also embarking on a broader possibility to embrace real world evidence, because it means that we can then, get products out faster and start to prove them out, as long as obviously there was no clinical risk involved, but start to prove out these use cases. And so the other part of this is the acceptance on the side of payers and players of the availability of potential real world evidence. So those are some of the headwinds. I just want to finish up one of the headwinds from a data standpoint, because one of the reasons why interoperability standards have come into the mix is because of the burden of the data that we currently have in a lot of these manufacturing environments and a lot of the clinical environments as well. The data is siloed, or the data is unstructured, and the data is uncleansed. Interoperability standards help us think into the future a little bit more, and then pull back into how we should be structuring our data, how we build our schemas, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just really a sort of method of paving the roads in the right way in order for us to be able to kind of leverage them, for the purposes of transforming value-based healthcare. So the good news side of this is there was really literally very little good news in 2020, but one thing COVID-19 did do is it actually really helped force almost open up some of these pathways for us. I think many of us in our different regions and our different countries are actually seeing quite a significant explosion of telemedicine. Necessity is the mother of invention. And so that's actually one of the best things that has happened from a digital health, telemedicine, and remote monitoring standpoint. So I'll give you a case which is a little bit of a twist on what we've written up in the white paper. In the white paper, we talk about this use case of knee surgery, so post-operative, perioperative and post-operative care, and how that can be delivered through an interoperable loop, really. In the case of COVID, you would have many patients who, if they weren't critical in terms of getting into an OT, would first of all not have been able to have that surgery. But second, say the cases of the ones that had the surgery just prior to clinical environments being locked down, well, what would have happened to their post-operative care? How would that have been delivered? How would the physical rehabilitation have been delivered? So again, that's a kind of case where you can look and really sense the need for that telemedicine, that video tutorial support, some channeling where in a minimally risky environment, you're really able to support patients and users moving forward. So I think for us as an interested party group, now is really a great time to continue to push this boundary of the importance of interoperability. And certainly I think speaking to the government bodies and the payers is going to be really good for us to kind of keep on pushing forward. Greg, anything to add to that?
No, I think you've covered it really well. From looking at it from a non-technical perspective, which is where I prefer to come from, we in MedTech are producing devices that we wish healthcare providers, hospitals, or individuals to use. I agree wholeheartedly with what you were saying before about the necessity with COVID change being necessary. If I look at the vaccine situation, for example, one of the things that's been done here is that the record of the vaccinations will go into the Australian Immunology Register, and that will be used, that data will be used to assist in opening up workforces, enabling travel, enabling students to come and study, etc. There is a lot of the tailwinds coming from clinicians. Many that we spoke to, and I don't think we're the only ones, many that we spoke to get really frustrated because they know what is possible, but they feel the technology or how it's being managed is holding them back. Interoperability will make such a difference. It's systems 101. You only store things you can't derive, and you only store them once. So to take the data from whatever the medical device is and to have it go bang, not just into the medical record, but into the data lake, which can be used to gain insights in disease change and management, etc. The business case is there. We just have to sell it to the people who are going to be buying these devices in language that they understand. At the end of the day, they're looking at improving health outcomes while reducing cost and risk.
Thank you very much, Shamini and Gregg. And maybe, Gregg, we can continue with another question. So who do you think are the most critical actors that we need to get on board to get interoperability in the field in the APAC region?
I divide into two camps. There are those who are responsible for the approval to use of medical devices in a given market. And the other ones are the healthcare providers who are going to be purchasing them. Okay. So from the regulators' side, we really do need to be lobbying, discussing with them the need for them to mandate minimum interoperability standards in the medtech they authorise for use in their individual jurisdictions. And with the healthcare providers, when medtech manufacturers and resellers are going into their market, the people who are going to be buying their product are the healthcare providers. Why should they buy your particular device? Interoperability adds to the business case because the health service provider doesn't incur the cost of manually taking data which is generated from one device and keying it into another system. That increases the cost and, more importantly, the risk. Shamini, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, probably twofold. I think probably an underleveraged group of critical contributors is the clinician, and you mentioned this earlier, you know, so if we take the tidal wave that we're currently going through now, being able to kind of harness the power of the clinicians is going to have a critical impact in, you know, changing some of those landscapes. And I think the second piece to that is building probably better collaboration in the manufacturing side of things, you know, which is why hopefully, you know, things like this work will continue to live on, because if we are agreeing to collaborate and participate in terms of offering a standardized environment, we're making it easier for the clinicians to talk to the government bodies and the payers to say, look, you know, this is already here for us, so why don't we take it like this?
Perfect. So for the third question, Gregg, maybe how do you think that we can ease or foster the market access for interoperable medical device systems?
So from my perspective, it's selling the business case to both regulators and healthcare providers in their language for their context. Again, at the end of the day, they're aiming to reduce cost and risk while driving improved health outcomes. The regulators are the ones who are, thank you. Sorry, my drink just arrived. The regulators are the ones who are responsible for enabling or allowing medtech innovation to operate in their market, and the health service providers can't buy it unless it's authorized. So it's those two drivers will help enable interoperability from the regulators and from the health service providers. Like I said, mandating interoperability standards within RFPs, RFTs, etc., will also go a long way. Shamini?
Yeah, I completely agree with the position on regulators. I think there's an exciting future ahead in terms of regulatory pathways from a digital standpoint, a digital health standpoint. There's certainly a lot of innovation potential in the areas of like software as medical devices and you know, we encounter this a lot, the kind of distinction between what is a piece of hardware versus what is a piece of software, and then what is the data that translates within that software environment. I certainly think in the Asia-Pacific environment, we could innovate that a lot better to allow for the remaining design controls that are required from a med device perspective, but actually get some of these products out to market faster if the level of change in the softwares and in the systems is not very great. So again, in the non-medical device world, you know, this gets released through sort of version controls. So what if we adopted these idea of version controls within the regulators, and instead of having to say go to the FDA or go to the CFDA with these, you know, 18-month pathways, this could be graded as a low-grade device or a low risk, and it could have like an accelerated pathway. So ideas like that, you know, need to come to fruition, because we're going to live in the world of hardware software for a very long period of time. So I think there's a lot of innovation potential in that space too.
If I can add, in the Australian context, it's really heartening to see the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration Authority, which is the regulator in Australia, they've actually come out with new draft standards and processes for medtech devices. So it is happening, but in each of our jurisdictions, we should be doing what we can to enhance that process and support it.
So I have one question that just came to my mind. So, for example, from Germany, I know that there are now laws out there, regulations out there that try to foster interoperability standards by, for example, supporting reimbursement schemes for EMRs. Is there something in the Asian Pacific region as well that you know of for countries? Are there programs from different countries, regions that try to support interoperability in that way?
I can bring to mind, it's not a regulation per se, but it's more of an invitation. So in Japan, there's a very big push to have interoperable data sets between hospitals and primary care facilities. And it's basically a layer of middleware known as SFSMIX2, and you need to interface with that layer of middleware in order for the data to be interoperable. So I think in Japan, they're certainly making standards. I believe there's a standard coming out in South Korea as well. I don't know it off the top of my head, but you know, certainly some markets are progressing down this pathway. I think also then, depending on how localized the EMR player is, some of those learnings could be imported certainly into some of our environments here.
I've got nothing more to add. That was good.
Thank you very much. So I have one question now that we come a little bit to the end of our panel discussion is, what do you think how the future of medical device interoperability will look like in the Asian Pacific region? What are your wishes? What do you think about it? So Shamini, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I mean, in full transparency, it's really hard to know. It's really hard to assess it. There are so many different factors at play. For example, a geographic data location, particularly geographic health data location, is a critical component of this interoperability. So, you know, there could be ways we figure out how to offshore data, you know, using hashing and anonymizing, etc. But that's a very big field that's changing very, very, very fast. And more often than not, governments are actually shutting it down. So they're siloing it to ensure that the data stays, citizens' data stays within the country of domicile. So that's a big piece for us, which definitely we have to crack and think through. I think the other thing is there's a lot of fragmentation in the industry. So there's fragmentation on the EMR side. There's fragmentation on whether the EMRs are third-party vendors or whether they're domestic providers owned and run by the government. And then there's even fragmentation in, you know, use cases of things like telemedicine or remote monitoring by non-medical device players. And so those examples are, you know, like WeChat, for example, plays in this space in China. Apple Health are looking to play in this space. Google are looking to play in this space. So it's a very complex landscape, which no one's really quite cracked. I think the other two big things which are particularly pertinent to the Asia Pacific environment are the absence of a lot of broad standards of care, which is corresponding very tightly to a lack of access to care, to a standard of care for many, many, many citizens, particularly where you've got countries with big spread or very diverse landscapes like Indonesia, which is made up of thousands of islands, or India, where you've got enormous gaps in inequality, in socioeconomic equality. So all of that, I think, really lead us to kind of think through, well, how are we going to make this work? And I don't know if I have the answer of how we're going to make it work in the future, but I do have the recommendation on why we should make it work in the future. And that is really the availability and the access to an improved standard of care, and therefore the hope of an improved clinical outcome for customers. That's my plan. whether we have everything that's going to line up to it or not, there's a lot of work to be done for sure. Greg?
Would agree. I think one of the challenges about our region is not only the diversity of health systems, but the range and maturity of digital health in each of those jurisdictions. I see there is a real opportunity for interoperability to be a key stone in accelerating the process in those countries that are coming from second, third, or fourth mover advantage doing the catch up. I'm thinking off the top of my head, for example, if we take a look at India, there is going to be a huge vaccination program about to start, about 1.5 billion people. But if we had interoperability, they could be using that to create an EMR record for everybody in India. Interoperability enables that. The data is king. The data will enable the clinicians to be able to make the decisions to improve the health outcomes. The other little bit I would add also is, you're talking before, Shamini, about fragmentation. If we take a look at the health process itself, there's 3 players who have been operating somewhat independently or very loosely in the past. There's the pharma companies that are providing the treatment, if you like. There's medtech, who's providing the artifacts that are used to provide that treatment. And then you've got the technology providers who are taking care of the data. They're often not talking to each other. Having interoperability, especially through the data standards side of it, will make such a difference. And we can do that by the 3 industry sectors working closely together and communicating more.
Thank you very much, Shamini and Greg. I would now like to invite also Roberta back into our discussion. And I think we have one question here. We are here together on behalf of APACMed. And so my final question is really, how can APACMed help to foster the adoption or to harness the power of interoperability within medical devices? Roberta.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. And I think it's a great question. And it also, when I was listening to Greg and Shamini, I heard a lot about awareness, fragmentation, making the bridge with all the stakeholders, not working in silos anymore. So I think that's all what we are trying to do. So if I have to resume our role and our mission, so the first step is really building knowledge and sharing knowledge. And I think Greg was pointing that earlier, right? So we are not all at the same stage in terms of maturity, in terms of awareness. And I think with this paper, what we tried to do, and the beauty of including narratives and concrete examples, is trying to explain to all the stakeholders across such a fragmented and diverse region what it is interoperability, why is that so important, how is it going to support not only the manufacturers, but all the healthcare stakeholders, right? from the healthcare professional to the hospitals, to the patients, the regulators, the people who look at value of, and we spoke about that, right? So value-based care, reimbursement, access, and so on. So interoperability, it's a great way for us to move things. So that was really the first step for us as a trade association. So our role was to start, from the same page. And I think we did that, and it's a first big step. The second part for us as a group will be to spread the word, so to build capability. And the way we do that is usually engaging then with the countries. So let me share a little bit more about what we are doing right now at APACMed in the Digital Health Committee. So if last year our scope was broader, so we didn't focus really on one specific stakeholder or one country, then this year we are going deep, right? So we are establishing country groups, we are interacting with stakeholders, with regulators, with deciders in the countries. So that's the second step. And the reason why we did all this, we built this paper was exactly to use it as a tool to have an impact in the region. So that will be our next step. And then, of course, beyond building capabilities, there is something that is also, at the end, our final and main purpose as a trade association, which is advocate and shape the policy. So once we will have built all that, we will have raise the awareness and engage with all the stakeholders across the region. Then we will be able to eventually shape the policy in order to get more of this interoperability within medical devices regulated in a way that we can actually benefit from it, and the patient can benefit of it. So I think that's a little bit about the role that we can play, and of course, we as a trade association, our members are mainly the medical device, the medtech manufacturers, now even more digital health companies, but also our role is to build an ecosystem, right? So it's not only interacting with the companies, but it's also to making this bridge with hospitals, with healthcare professionals, regulators, and policymakers. So that's where I think we can, where we can really play a role, right? So trying to build this digital health community that needs to work more closely together across the countries. And I think, Shamini, you mentioned that before, right? So some of your ambitions for the future, and I think that's exactly what brings us all together, right? So that said, maybe I can ask Shamini, as you were appointed as a chair of this interoperability working group last year, what is your perspective as a representative of the manufacturers?
Yeah, I guess my viewpoint on this is that we can't go at it alone in Asia Pacific. That there is no one, not that I can think of anyway, one manufacturer that can go in and dictate, for example, that we'll all be interoperable. So to your point, Roberta, there's really two things. There's how do we build a coalition that's going to matter in terms of impact to the users, both the clinicians and the inpatients, and two, how do we foster a relationship of collaboration, which is also sensitive to some of the commercial needs of the organizations. Is it possible? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there are ways of doing this work. There's certainly ways of setting up standards or adopting standards, that we could collaborate much better on. So, I do feel like the role of APACMed is very powerful, particularly in this environment, given the amount of fragmentation we've got in Asia Pacific. We don't have standards like a CE mark, for example, which all of a sudden will open up the door very quickly. And as Stefan was sharing, even to the extent that some big government players, they're actually declaring they're pulling for the interoperability to happen. Certainly, I can't think of a use case like that at the moment in Asia Pac. Therefore, things like that, providing the evidence base for that to occur, I think would be something that APACMed could really contribute greatly to.
Would agree. I also think it's a very positive step that we've gone from, if you like, a centralized model where everybody's around the one table, that we're moving now to regional centers of excellence where we will be closer, if you like, to the ground and the specific needs and restrictions within each jurisdiction to be able to progress the discussions with regulators, with the health service providers, and also the regulators and the health service providers.
Thank you very much, Shamini and Greg. And before we hand over to Roberta for, let's say, the final note for today, I would also like to really thank that I could participate in this discussion. It was a real pleasure to work with you in developing our position paper. And I'm also really looking forward to see how APACMed can really help to foster the adoption of interoperable standards and solutions in the region. And as you know, if you have any question from the audience, we didn't see anything in the chat by now, but if you have later on questions, just contact one of us and we will be happy to answer, or contact any other member of the Interoperability Working Group. So for the final note, maybe it's up to you, Roberta, again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. And yeah, I think let me as well thank you and the team from Unity for being so supportive and for all your hard work. Not easy to support us as a group because we are so diverse and we are all passionate, but we all come from different companies and sometimes countries and geography. So thanks a lot for the great work, and thanks as well to Shamini and Greg, who supported the paper since the beginning. And yeah, in terms of next steps, what I would like to say is that if you all on this webinar want to know more about our next initiatives in this field, I invite you to follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, if you want to know more, you can engage, you can contact me directly or any of the APACMed Digital Health Committee members. We are always happy to discuss. And then third thing that I wanted to mention, so we will engage more in the countries, and we will also, I think I heard a lot also this word, data, evidences, and value-based care. So we are currently, starting a new project with the Digital Health Committee. We will be able to share more about that. And that said, I want to thank all of you for joining and you three for speaking. And see you next at the next event. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.